And now to talk more about the AirAsia flight and airline safety, we're joined by Seth Kaplan in St. Petersburg, Florida. Seth is a managing partner at Airline Weekly Corporation, which publishes airline industry news. Seth, thanks for joining us on our broadcast.
Hi, Susan. Good to be here. As always, wish it was for better news.
We've been reporting there was another AirAsia incident, as you know, Sunday when passengers were ordered off a plane with engine trouble, and then most of those passengers refused to get back on the plane, even after the issue was resolved. Did they make the right decision?
Probably not, Susan. You know, what does happen is that after something like the tragedy that we experienced a week ago, people do become more sensitive to anything. And it sounds, with the details that we do have about what happened Sunday, like this was something that, although certainly nothing that one of us wants to have happen before we fly, a lot more routine. You know, the system worked. They found it before the people flew in and took care of the issue. But you do tend to hear about every issue, understandably enough, at an airline after it's experienced a tragedy. This not something so unusual compared to some of the things that happen around the world every day.
Seth, there are reports that AirAsia was not licensed to fly between Surabaya and Singapore, the route of Flight 8501 on the day of the crash. It's being investigated right now. What impact could this have on the airline?
Well, what we need to find out, and it certainly does seem to be corroborated at this point that they shouldn't have been flying that day, we need to find out if this was something that was just routinely violated by most airlines, or if it was an AirAsia specific issue. To be clear, what they're alleging is not that there was a safety issue related to that per se. It was more of an issue between the countries in terms of how much countries have bilateral agreements that govern how many people can fly from one country to another, and they have to be fair to airlines on both sides. So the allegation is that more of a political issue than a safety issue that they were flying on that day. But certainly, any violation at all when you're dealing with a tragedy like this is something that does need to be looked at, and I'm sure it will be.
Obviously, this Flight 8501 and the search has brought up a lot of memories of the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, bad weather impacting the search near Indonesia. There was also a delay finding the wreckage of Air France Flight 447, which crashed off the coast of Brazil in 2009. Tell us about the conditions that make it so hard to find wreckage during these investigations.
Yeah, well, the bad news here is that the weather, in fact, some of the same kind of weather that unfortunately likely played some role, at least in this crash, persists. So it's making it difficult to bring up the wreckage. This accident, although, we always kind of grasp for analogies like the ones that you mentioned, each incident is different, obviously compared to MH370, at least here we know where the plane is roughly. We have a debris field. And even compared to Air France 447, which was less of a mystery than Malaysia Airlines 370, in that case, the plane crashed in very deep water. So although there was a pretty good idea of where in the world it went down, it took nearly 2 years to find the debris field. So in this case, far ahead of that, in that, here we are a week later and we do know where the debris is, although it's certainly so frustrating that it can't be brought up sooner, and then unfortunately the remains of the people who perished aren't being brought up sooner. But less of a mystery, certainly, than 370, and even less so than Air France 447.
Seth, what do you think about experience and training of some of these pilots, let's say AirAsia, Malaysia Airlines, versus some of those in the West, let's say like Delta or American?
It's a fair question, and certainly Indonesia has experienced more than its share, rather, of incidents. And so then the question becomes, well, why? Because no question that more has happened there than you would hope would happen. In this case, the captain, in particular, of that AirAsia flight had a whole lot of experience. When you look at more than 20,000 hours, certainly experience commensurate with what you might find at a captain at any airline like the ones that you mentioned in the West or elsewhere. The first officer somewhat less experienced, but that's always the case. So with their experience per se, nothing necessarily that comes to light. But the question is, okay, Indonesia certainly has its problems. Is that a question of something, yes, related to training, or is it simply a function of how much air traffic there is, and that the country perhaps isn't managing that air traffic as well as possible? We heard just before I came on a few minutes ago about the island geography of Indonesia. That's important because Indonesia, with a very big population population, and a population that can't be connected, for example, by rail. If you think about a place like China, for example, which has invested in its rail infrastructure in recent years to take some of the load off of air transport, Indonesia doesn't have the luxury of rail because of that island geography. So it's either very slow boats in many cases or air traffic, and the airline industry has grown very rapidly, and fair questions being raised about whether the country's infrastructure has been able to handle it.
Well, Seth, I want to talk specifically about 8501. I mean, there are reports that the pilot was approaching weather and wanted to, avert the weather, but was denied the clearance to do so by air traffic control. Let's say, do you think this could have been cultural, that they just went with what air traffic control told them, as opposed to figuring out a way to get around it?
Yeah, another fair question too, Susan. And there have indeed over the years been incidents where it turned out that perhaps cultural issues caused a pilot perhaps to not communicate the urgency of an issue in the way that they should have. Far too early in this case to say that that's the situation, and that's the kind of thing that when the cockpit voice recorders, for example, hopefully come to light at some point, if the pilots between each other were expressing more alarm than they had expressed during that request to climb, then indeed that would be the kind of thing you'd say, do we have to do something more in terms of, telling people basically that however deferential you might want to be culturally, you need to communicate more urgency. Again, far too early to say that that's the case, but you are correct that it's in certain incidents over the years that has indeed been the case. So if the pilot knew that the situation was worse than he had communicated, that would be something we need to look at, and whether pilots need to be trained in a different way, particularly in certain countries that are, quite frankly, more polite in certain ways than others. Something that's maybe good in certain circles, but not when it comes to being very direct in aviation communications.
Certainly not. Seth Kaplan, thank you so much as always. Nice to see you in St. Petersburg, Florida.